Sometimes you can do everything just right and still have high blood sugars. You change your diet and you work on your sleep and you move more and you strength train, and yet your glucose levels are still high. Well, one missing food that a lot of people miss is not food at all. It's what you drink. And certain drinks as an add-on can actually meaningfully drop your blood sugars. So that's exactly what I want to go over today. But as we go through these, what I don't want you to take away from this is here's a list of good drinks you try random. Each of these drinks works through a different biological pathway that helps in specific situations. And this is important. Every one of these drinks also has real downsides and contraindications. So make sure you pay attention to those because the goal is to lower your blood sugar, but to do it safely. And as always, even though I'm a physician, I'm not your physician. So please talk to your doctor before you make any changes to your health regimen because this information is educational only and not medical advice. So first, let's start with aloe vera juice. And aloe vera is usually thought of as something you put on your skin. But in a juice form, it can actually help you lower your blood sugars. Aloe vera has been used as a natural remedy for centuries, and it contains over 70 active compounds, including vitamins and important amino acids. And a lot of those compounds, they help your sugars in many different ways. Aloe vera contains polysaccharides and polyphenols that improve insulin signaling at the cellular level. And in simple terms, how that translates to real life. Well, insulin just works better. Your glucose moves out of the bloodstream and into your muscle and your liver cells more efficiently. And on top of that, aloe vera also affects your gut. It slows down carbohydrate breakdown and absorption in the small intestine, which means you don't get huge spikes of blood sugar after a meal. And there's data that suggests that aloe also works on your liver and reduces a process called hepatic gluconeogenesis. So basically, your liver just doesn't make as much glucose. So there was a meta-analysis of 5 randomized control trials that found that aloe vera supplementation significantly reduced fasting blood glucose by 30 milligrams per deciliter, and it reduced hemoglobin A1C by 4% in people with prediabetes and early non-treated diabetes. But there's one thing to note though. All the studies combined in the meta-analysis are pretty small, and there wasn't a standard dose or amount of aloe vera that was used. In some studies, participants drank juice, and in other studies, they use powder or gel. I think the easiest way to get it is to buy aloe vera juice at your local store. And I would just make sure there's minimal added sugars and flavoring. Now, some people like to get pure aloe vera juice, which is just a liquid that comes from juicing an aloe leaf. And then they dilute it with water or lemon or honey to taste. What I don't usually recommend is extracting the gel from the plant yourself unless you know exactly what you're doing, because not all varieties of aloe vera are safe to consume, and the leaves have to be at a certain level of freshness. Now, aloe vera juice is generally tolerated when it's properly prepared. I would just make sure that whatever product you're using has been processed to remove anthraquin compounds. The established safe limit for those in aloe products should be less than 50 parts per million, and the lower the better. And the aloe needs to be collected from the properly sourced inner leaf gel rather than from your whole leaf extract. And this is to once again minimize that anthraquinone contamination. And this is very important because contaminated products with anthraquinones can give you lots of side effects like diarrhea. And there are some case reports that even documented liver toxicity with oral preparations. So I would not drink this if you have any liver issues like fatty liver or hepatitis, and it's also contraindicated in pregnancy. Also, aloe vera can meaningfully lower your blood sugar. So you just have to be careful if you're already taking diabetes medications, especially drugs like sulfonylureas or insulin. So I would definitely discuss this with your doctor before adding this to your regimen. Now let's move on to the next drink, which is fenugreek water. So fenugreek is a seed that's commonly used in cooking, but metabolically it has natural glucose-lowering properties. There was a 2024 meta-analysis of 19 studies that found that fenugreek lowered plasma glucose, and it lowered hemoglobin A1C and HOMWARE, which is a marker of insulin resistance, and the mechanism by which it works is fascinating. So fenugreek actually acts at the hormonal level. It contains an amino acid called 4-hydroxyisoleucine, which is a special amino acid that enhances insulin secretion from the pancreas. But it does so only in the presence of high blood sugars. And that distinction matters because it supports insulin release only when it's needed without driving blood sugars too low. And there's also evidence that fenugreek improves insulin sensitivity in muscle and liver tissue. Now let's talk about how to actually use it. The simplest and most common approach is fenugreek seed water, where you just soak about 1 teaspoon of seeds overnight and then in the morning you drink the water. And some people like to chew the seeds. And if you do eat the seeds, you'll also get this special type of soluble fiber called galactoannin, which then forms a gel in your gut. And it slows down glucose absorption and it helps with glucose spikes after meals. Now, just like with the aloe vera data, the studies in fenugreek have been pretty small, and there's no uniform dose that was used across different study designs, and most studies use anywhere between 5 to 20 grams of fenugreek, but the dose could be different depending on if you're using germinated seeds or extract powder. So I always recommend starting with the lowest dose and then working your way up just to avoid potential GI side effects. And just like with aloe vera, I would be very careful if you're already on diabetes medications. And I would definitely discuss this with your doctor before you add this to your regimen to make sure you don't need to adjust your medications first. And another important precaution is fenugreek is contraindicated in pregnancy and breastfeeding. And do not take fenugreek if you have a peanut or chickpea or a soybean allergy, or if you have asthma, as there may be some possible cross-reactivity. Next, let's talk about green tea. And I talk about green tea quite a bit in my other videos because it has so many amazing benefits. So green tea affects blood sugar through several overlapping biological pathways, and none of them have to do with calories or sweetness. Green tea changes glucose metabolism at the very basic cellular level. So the first pathway is insulin sensitivity. Green tea is rich in kcans, especially a polyphenol called EGCG, which stands for epigallocatechin gallate. And these compounds improve insulin signaling in muscle cells, which then helps shuttle glucose out of the bloodstream and into the tissues more efficiently. And green tea also affects your gut, where kcans slow down enzymes like alpha amylase, which are responsible for breaking down carbohydrates into glucose. So without those enzymes, you don't absorb as many sugars. So this helps you lower your glucose spikes after meals. And there was a 2024 meta-analysis of 15 randomized controlled trials in patients with type 2 diabetes. And what they found was that green tea intervention significantly improved multiple markers of blood sugar control. So it improved things like fasting blood glucose and A1C and insulin resistance. Now let's talk about precautions. Most people tolerate 1 to 3 cups of green tea per day pretty well, but I'll be very cautious if you're using green tea extracts or pills. In fact, I never recommend those because green tea extracts at higher doses have been reported to cause liver injury. Now, the European Food Safety Authority showed that doses above 800 milligrams of EGCG kcans per day are associated with increases in liver enzymes, and a safe upper limit from toxicological and human safety data is less than 700 mg per day or less than 330 mg as a single bolus or a single drink. But the tricky thing is, catechin concentrations are different depending on what type of green tea you drink. But ballpark number-wise, 1 cup of green tea has about anywhere from 50 to 150 grams of kcans. So I think for most people, I would not drink more than 2 to 3 cups of green tea per day. And another important precaution is green tea can interfere with the absorption of iron. So if you're dealing with low iron or iron deficiency anemia, I would just avoid drinking green tea around the time you're eating iron-rich foods or taking your iron supplements. There was actually a tiny study done. It was only 12 women. But for what it's worth, it showed that consuming green tea with an iron-containing meal reduced iron absorption by 37%. But if you delay drinking green tea by 1 hour after eating, well then iron absorption was only reduced by 18%. Next, let's talk about coffee. And this surprises a lot of people. But we have large prospective cohort studies and meta-analyses that show that habitual coffee consumption is associated with a reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. One important thing to note, though, is a lot of these studies are based on observational data that just looks at associations. But as you already know, we cannot infer causation. But based on the limited data, the associations are fairly strong, and the risk of type 2 diabetes is reduced in a dose-dependent manner, meaning the more coffee you drink, the lower the risk. A good example of this is this study published in Diabetes Care, and they looked at 28 prospective studies with over 1.1 million participants with a follow-up duration up to 20 years. And based on that data compared to no or rare coffee consumption, drinking just 1 cup per day lower your risk by 8%, and drinking 2 cups per day lower the risk by 15%. And at 3 cups, there's a 21% risk reduction. And the study looked at consumption of as high as 6 cups per day, where they saw a 33% risk reduction. Now, this is not to say you should drink as many cups of coffee as you can, but that inverse relationship is pretty interesting. And mechanistically, it is plausible for coffee to help with blood sugar because coffee contains a special type of polyphenols called chlorogenic acid, which is known to improve insulin sensitivity in muscle and liver cells. And coffee also boosts several cellular defense pathways involving NRF2 and AMPK and sirtuins. All those pathways help reduce stress on the beta cells in the pancreas, which is responsible for making and regulating insulin. Now let's talk about cinnamon tea. And cinnamon is a natural insulin sensitizer. And the main player here is an active compound found in cinnamon called cinnamaldehyde, which activates a special cellular pathway called IRS1P13K pathway, which helps your cells have a better response to insulin. The more efficient the response, the more your cells are able to move glucose out of the bloodstream and into your cells. And just like with green tea, cinnamon also blocks enzymes like alpha amylase and alpha glucosidase, which then helps slow down the breakdown and absorption of carbohydrates in the intestines. There was a recent meta-analysis published in 2024 that included 24 randomized control trials that showed that cinnamon supplementation had a statistically significant reduction in fasting blood sugar and hemoglobin A1C and HOMOR. Now, some people like to take cinnamon as a supplement, but there are studies like this one that show you may have better effect consuming cinnamon as a powder dissolved in water as a beverage as opposed to capsules. But that was a very small study with only 19 participants. So it's hard to make any recommendation either way. But a nice and easy way to get the benefits is to consume it as cinnamon tea, where you just mix a cinnamon stick with boiling water. Now, in most of these cinnamon studies, the typical dose was about 1 to 2 grams per day. And I would recommend drinking that tea before carbohydrate-heavy meals, as this will help you blunt that glucose spikes and slow down the absorption of sugars in the intestines. But one thing that is super important is to make sure you get the right form of cinnamon. So make sure you get the Ceylon cinnamon and not the other common type called cassia cinnamon, because cassia cinnamon contains a compound called coumarin, which can be toxic to your liver at higher doses. All right, so these are some of my favorite drinks that can help you lower your blood sugar. But these drinks are not in any way a replacement for good nutrition and sleep and exercise. And depending on how advanced your diabetes is, these drinks will not replace your medications. But it is a nice add-on to give you some additional leverage to slowly bring down your blood sugars. All right, I hope this was helpful. Stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next